All right, good afternoon, everyone. Now, clearly I am not as polished a speaker here as Smitty, but I got to confess I'm a fan of his last name. And I'm sure that both of us being Smiths were somehow related, but somehow one of us fell on the wrong side of the tracks along the way and ended up at a utility. That being said, I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today about CPS Energy and our plans and how we plan to work on the proposed carbon rule and what we are doing about it. A little bit of background in terms of where we're going. Obviously, the new rule has come out, and it's obviously aimed at reducing carbon emissions. One pundit once told me that there are only two things in life that are certain: death and taxes. As I've been joking with our executive team, I'd like to add a third, and that is change. Change is really rapidly approaching the utility industry, and so much of it is inevitable. And many times utilities have thought that they could stand, so to speak, in the dike and prevent it. I'm here to tell them and you all that we can't. And instead of fighting it, it's better to row with it and find ways to optimize our portfolio and our offers for customers. That being said, obviously what we're looking at here is how we need to comply with the proposed 111D rule and getting flexibility through our state plan and through our own generation plan to meet these targets. Really, there are two different things under consideration, those for new units and those for existing units. And as you can see here, essentially there are these two parallel timelines for how the rules will come about in relation to these different types of plants. That being said, regardless of what the final shape is, changes here, it is going to happen for us. So what do we do to move forward? Well, the first is to understand, of course, the four primary blocks associated with the goal. As it was previously mentioned, the first one is really focused on how the coal-fired plants are actually running in terms of their efficiency and how they can be improved. Secondly, the second big block is really how we dispatch natural gas units relative to those other units. Third is, of course, the use of renewables and, of course, nuclear power. And fourth is the utilization of energy efficiency. Together, these make up all the different major components that a utility can take to essentially comply with the goal. And let's see, well, this is essentially a repeat of that, but I would like to point out a couple of interesting things, and I have heard the same pundits that talk about the amount of bill impacts that these sorts of things will occur, what they will do, and how we will do them. I'll tell you, I don't know the answer. I really don't. I do know that what I've been charged with doing is figuring out how to comply with it and make it work, regardless of those sorts of pundits. So in terms of the rule, of course, we obviously have a rate that we have to meet, and it's expressed in terms of pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. In looking outside of this, the traditional rule setting was really always looking inside the fence, essentially at the power plant itself and what the power plant does. And in this instance, it's a bit of a different take in that it's looking for opportunities outside the traditional generation fence and how we can utilize things like renewables, which is distributed generation, and things like energy efficiency, which is, of course, affecting how consumers use energy, and including those as benefits in the rule. The previous action doesn't necessarily translate to less stringent goals, and one of the concerns that the utilities have is that if they were proactive, they are concerned that perhaps some of their proactive work that they did may not be captured or may not be adequately reflected. Certainly that's something that will be explored further as the rule gets implemented. And of course there are two different opportunities here to look at how the rule may be implemented. One is a mass-based program, and then one is a total tons of emissions. Basically, you can think of it as a cap and trade program. And each state necessarily has to come up with how they will comply. And so one state's plan may look very different than another. And I actually moved here from North Carolina, and I can say that from what they plan to do will probably be very different than what Texas plans to do. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If the state doesn't submit the plan, the EPA, of course, will submit one for you. In law school, they would say if you die and you don't have a will, the state has prepared one for you. In this instance, not to necessarily have a death benefit, but you know, the EPA has prepared one for us if the state does not make its own action. I think that's good because it does force action, right? It forces people to deal with the change and start moving forward. That being said, this of course looks like Texas's emission rates reduction in terms of what we think may happen. Of course, the way the rule, or at least what's initially been proposed, is that we will improve coal efficiency by about 9%, meaning we'll wring out about that much more in additional efficiencies from those power plants. Increased natural gas generation, essentially we'll redispatch them or add new generation. That's about 45%. That's a pretty big chunk. Increased renewables, 31%. You know, one of the nice things about Texas that I never had in North Carolina was not only does Texas have an amazing wind resources, Texas also has amazing solar resources. So in that sense, I think Texas is well positioned to actually do far more in renewables. Increase energy efficiency. This particular one in my past when I was at a former utility got me labeled by someone in the finance organization as a communist. I'm not really sure how that qualified me as a communist, but using the word energy efficiency apparently sometimes draws those comparisons. That being said, I do think there are ample opportunities for energy efficiency that we can take advantage of. And then, of course, the at-risk nuclear here, or the nuclear component. Altogether, this would represent what Texas's proposed plan may look like. And as you can see, it leans heavily on not just renewables, but also on natural gas generation. So this is actually CPS Energy's portfolio, and pardon me for the busy slide, but essentially what it is if you watch the dark blue line here, this is our total generation capacity over time, really beginning in the 80s and then looking forward into time into the late 2020s, 2030. The blue line, the light blue line, which begins about at the 25 line on the far left side of the equation and then drops down to the far right side of the equation, that is our carbon intensity. And that's of interest here because if you look at that line, you see one noticeable trend, even if you take it only up to today, which is to say that the slope is downward, not flat, not up. At the same time, our generation portfolio has been going up. Now, the difference between the blue line and, of course, the green line and the red lines, essentially the red line is the proposed target for Texas, and the green line, that essentially represents a 33% reduction. These are the differences in the formula depending on how we use nuclear. That being said, they're all still going down, and CPS's performance is that we are absolutely on our path towards achieving these targets. That being said, it doesn't mean that we have any easy path ahead of us. A couple of interesting things to note. If you'll look around 1993, there is this funny little blue spike that happens in our carbon intensity. And that's the year the South Texas project went down. Essentially, we had to replace nuclear generation that year with carbon-producing generation, which is primarily coal. And you can see what happened to our portfolio in terms of our emissions profile. It looked pretty bad. That is not going in the right direction. It needs to go the other way. But you can see in the subsequent years that continued to tail off. Better yet, we have announced that we are going to retire or we should mothball essentially one of our coal-fired plants, and that too will further benefit our portfolio. So many people tell me this, and they look at this slide and they say, that is really great. I bet you have very expensive rates. The one thing I always point out to those folks is that CPS, out of the 20 major metropolitan areas in the United States, has the lowest rates amongst those metropolitan areas. So I would say that it's still possible. It's still possible not just to comply, but to meet the goals as they've been stated, and to continue to keep your rates low, especially here in Texas, where we have so much in the way of renewables, so much in the way of natural gas, so much here in the way of energy efficiency. It's not as gloomy as some may paint. Now, of course, there's the alternate approach, which is the mass-based approach. Either way here, you can see where we have planned the shutdown of the Dealey plant, which is one of our coal-fired plants, and you can see that will drop, once again, our numbers in terms of the carbon intensity of the fleet, and we expect to continue to see reductions over time as we do even more. That being planned, so what are we going to do about this? How are we going to move forward? Well, as I mentioned, we're the first and foremost is that we're retiring Dealey units 1 and 2. That's going to take a significant chunk out of the carbon emissions. The second is renewables. So if I asked the audience, who do you think is the largest utility supplier of renewable generation in Texas? Would CPS Energy be the first company on your mind? Yeah. CPS Energy is #1. We're #1 in Texas and #6 nationwide in terms of renewable energy. If I were to ask you who has the largest demand response portfolio in Texas, would you think of CPS Energy? Yes, it's CPS Energy. Unfortunately, we do a very good job about maintaining a reliable grid and providing power. We do a very bad job of marketing. Hopefully, we will get better at that. But renewables is clearly an important part of that. We have done an innovative thing in San Antonio. We have partnered with a solar manufacturer to actually bring in-panel type production to Texas as part of our groundbreaking renewables plan, where not only do we have the solar manufacturing in Texas, we signed a very large PPA agreement where we are essentially putting in 315 megawatts of solar power in San Antonio. With that, of course, we obviously have over 1,000 megawatts of existing wind and over 130 megawatts of existing rooftop solar. And we've already announced community solar plans as well as a solar PPA model where we will essentially be trying to build out even more rooftop solar over the coming years. Natural gas combined cycle plants, we purchased Rio Nogales. This certainly improves the efficiency of our fleet. And of course, demand response and energy efficiency, we have a 771 megawatt target in terms of what we're trying to reduce from capacity. But one of the things I pointed out is that capacity, or reducing capacity, doesn't have a very big impact on carbon emissions. Essentially, what you're doing for carbon emissions is looking at megawatt hours. And so we may rethink this particular target and start focusing on megawatt hours in addition to megawatts in terms of how to make our fleet more efficient. And then, of course, we have a 40% ownership in the South Texas project, as well as an 8% ownership in the next generation units were they to be built. Interesting thing, here's our portfolio as it stands right now. And the interesting thing, of course, is that coal is about 40%, and that's the primary carbon emitter. Gas around 17%, and of course nuclear at about 24%. But look at all the rest of that. The rest of that really presents the opportunity of the future: wind, solar, landfill gas, and of course our energy efficiency programs. And this is, of course, it on a capacity basis. The real interesting part, though, is when you move from capacity and energy as it looks today, and then look at where you expect it to be in 2020. And I think the interesting thing here is that you'll see a shifting significantly away from coal and more towards gas and, of course, the other renewable resources. Now, the one word of caution I would provide is the silver bullet syndrome, which is to believe that any one technology or fuel source is the absolute savior of your fleet and your capabilities. In this instance, I would offer the caution that really over-reliance on any one thing, whether it be coal, gas, or anything else, really can result in unexpected consequences in terms of rate shock and volatility, which of course we would seek to minimize, but certainly why we tend to want a balanced portfolio of different options. One other fun thing about renewable energy projects, since I am new to Texas, I moved here in May, I'm still lucky to find the grocery store where I live, so I rely on this map quite a bit to figure out where things are. First, I have to orient myself as to where I am, usually in San Antonio. But the nice thing about this that I think it points out is that Texas has a variety of locations where wind and solar thrive. In North Carolina, where I'm from, they always say the Outer Banks are a wonderful spot. Too bad you can't build them there. So are the Appalachian Mountains just to the west. They've got this funky thing called the trail, the Blue Ridge Trail that goes through there, and oh yeah, you can't build there either. And so while they have resources, they can't use any of them. Texas doesn't have that issue. We have wonderful capability here, and we have now great transmission that allows this to get to market much more easily. Of course, here's our Alamo 4 site, and like every other solar facility in the world, it consists of solar panels. Lots of them. Lots and lots and lots, as far as the eye can see. So it's not surprising in that sense. What is surprising is how we got it, which was that innovative deal on the New Energy Economy Partners, where we brought this company to build not only the solar panels, but to build jobs and invest in San Antonio. And we really think that public-private partnership is the right way to grow, not just for our own utility, but really for our own community. And we think that's really the path forward on how to not just comply, but to meet these rules, right? Because it's more than just compliance, right? We're talking about, as Jim Rogers, my former CEO, would say, it's about the grandchildren test. If we're not leaving what we do in a better shape for our grandchildren, why are we really doing it? And so I look at Alamo 4, and other than seeing lots and lots and lots of solar panels, I really see the future here. I see the opportunity for the utility to really bring new technology and new capabilities to meet the challenges of regulation and the environment moving forward. Mission Solar, as I've mentioned quite a few times, there was a grand opening here not too long ago. If any of you are ever in San Antonio, I highly recommend to look us up or them up, and we are happy to make it available so that you can come through and tour their facility. They make very high efficient N-type panels, and these jobs are really transforming San Antonio from being primarily an oil and gas and military town to also a high-tech hub. And I think that's very important as we move forward. So our position as a company, of course, we're not going to contest the legality of this proposed rule. We're really going to focus on how do we move forward? How do we embrace change? How do we continue to find new ways to do the things that we need to do? Of course, working through this process, what we're really going to make sure is that we get credit for what we've done. Unlike other utilities, we saw this well in advance, and we have been working really since about 2010, 2009 to make sure that our portfolio is properly positioned so that when we get to the actual rule, that we actually have set ourselves up and our customers up to actually benefit. So we are, of course, we're commenting. I'm not sure how many of those comments are ours, probably a few, but we are certainly commenting on that. And of course, we're encouraging EPA to allow the states the maximum flexibility. We really think that's important because, of course, states are not cookie cutters. And certainly the resources available to each state are not cookie cutters. So the more flexibility we have, the more we can actually, I think, get better compliance. With that, I'm certainly looking forward to the question and answer session of the panel and happy to be here today. Thank you very much.